Hey there everyone, I'm Luke and today we're diving down the tube of Toons to break down the second episode of Marvel Studios' What If. Every week here at Tube of Toons we are going to be breaking down every episode of Marvel's What If, and this week's episode is What If T'Challa Became a Star-Lord. Now these are going to be full spoiler breakdowns, so if you haven't seen the episode yet, go on over to Disney Plus and watch the episode before you watch this, because I'm going to ruin everything. I do want to apologise and say I know that these videos are running behind. I imagine this episode is actually going to go up after you've seen the third episode, but I'm going to try and get better. The first episode was quite long, so I'm going to try and keep these ones a lot shorter, and hopefully that means we're going to get them out faster. And before we get started, can I just ask you all to hit that like button? It boosts us in the algorithm and allows us to get seen by so many more people. What did I think of this episode? Well, it's very different to last week. Last week was more of a one small change, whereas this was practically a completely alternate universe. And I will point out, this is something that is true to the What If comics as well. Sometimes they are based on a very specific comic book storyline, and what if one small change happened and how events would play out from there. Basically what we got last week. Whereas sometimes it's more of a what if a crazy concept happened. This was definitely the latter, and those can be really fun, and you get things that you just normally wouldn't see in the main storyline. Now, I personally do prefer the former. I actually did enjoy last week's episode more than this. I still love this episode, don't get me wrong, but I do think that one small change is more up my alley. I just think these episodes, they're quite short. They're 30 minutes long, which granted is more than a typical superhero animated show. They normally only get 20-minute episodes, but it's still a short amount of time when you're introducing such big reality altering concepts. I particularly just enjoy the fun of seeing the slight differences, whereas here I do just feel that because things are just so different, you are basically being introduced to completely new characters, and you don't get to spend a whole lot of time with them within that single issue or the 30-minute space, which can make a lot of characters just feel a little underdeveloped because you don't really get to spend that much time with them. That being said, this episode does that concept of changing things so drastically and being an almost entirely different alternate reality incredibly well. And while it still does technically fit into that one small change, it just so happens that that one small change took place 26 years before this episode. It happened in 1988 when the Ravagers were meant to take Peter Quill. Instead they ended up taking T'Challa. And then this episode is presumably set in 2014, which is when the original Guardians of the Galaxy movie took place. It's just more so that that small change that happened then creates lots of snowballing ramifications that by the time you hit 2014, almost everything has changed. All the characters are completely different to the ones we know and love, and they're great to see, but like I said, you don't get to spend a lot of time with them. And I think a lot of the crux of the episode, a lot of the humour in the episode comes from just the fact that, hey, there's that character that you know and they're acting completely different to how you expect them to act. It's still fun to see, and I think the actors all did a fantastic job. You can tell everyone in this episode had a fantastic time making it, and yeah, it's incredibly fun to watch. I'm not knocking this episode. I think there is just something like that does feel maybe a little bit lacking, I'm sorry to say. So at the end of last week's breakdown, I did talk about how this episode was going to be similar to Guardians of the Galaxy. It was sort of going to be set in that world, and I recommended watching Guardians of the Galaxy before going into this episode. I rewatched the Guardians of the Galaxy last night before this episode came out, and I forgot how great that film was. It is definitely one of my favourite Marvel films. It's just such a good film from start to finish. And I do feel like that may have actually worked against this episode. Again, not because this episode was bad, but I just think the first Guardians of the Galaxy film is so good that when I compare this to it, it's almost just not fair. This is a 30-minute animated alternate universe thing compared to a 2-hour cinematic masterpiece. I freaking love the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and I think one of my favourite aspects about it is the way it juxtaposes the otherworldly visuals, and with Peter Quill, just this down-to-earth, relatable guy. Part of the fun of that movie is seeing all these different aliens interact with that Earth guy who's just really quirky and different to them, but to us he's like fairly normal. He's always singing along to music, he's carrying around his Walkman, and I feel that this episode kind of is missing that. This episode is almost just completely spacebound. By the time we meet T'Challa, He's already settled into traveling the galaxy, much like Peter Quill had. But T'Challa isn't this relatable, down-to-earth figure. He's royalty, and he just naturally fits in to leading his team and leading the Ravagers in this episode, and that's fantastic to see. But I do think it takes away that almost charm of the original Guardians of the Galaxy movie, which, in fairness to this episode, it isn't trying to recreate Guardians of the Galaxy. The first scene definitely does, but then it veers off in a completely separate direction. But I just think when comparing it to the original Guardians of the Galaxy, this episode does fall short somewhat. I think Peter Quill may have been slightly more interesting to watch. He was a very flawed character, and to me that's what almost made the movie. They even say in the movie itself, the characters are a bunch of a-holes. Well, here, everyone seems to be almost a goody two-shoes. They're all perfect. And while it's definitely something different, it's something interesting to see. I don't think they're super strong characters. I do think they work here, but I don't know how well they'd work outside of this one small contained story. But then again, that is the beauty of What If, isn't it? It's these short one-shot stories, and you don't really have to worry about revisiting them again. Now, let's talk about T'Challa himself. Well, I would argue that he is actually a completely different character to the T'Challa we know. And again, makes sense, right? For the last 26 years he's been living in space. Of course he's going to be different. He's this sort of omnibenevolent, all good, perfect character that at times can almost feel a bit like a Gary Stu. He's perfect. He has almost no character flaws beyond maybe that he's a little too trusting of Yondu when he believes in that Wakanda has been destroyed. But that doesn't really feel like a character flaw. You can understand why a child would believe that. And I suppose he's never really had any real reason to question it. Because the minute he suspects that Wakanda hasn't been destroyed, he questions Yondu straight away. But this version of T'Challa is so perfect that he has managed to convince the Ravagers to be the sort of merry men to his Robin Hood. They're stealing these artifacts and they're giving them to people and to civilizations that needs them. And I feel like this is one of the first things in the episode where you look at it and you think, that's maybe a little bit of a stretch. You've got to remember, these were supposedly the same Ravagers featured in the first two Guardians of the Galaxy movies. The ones that threatened to eat Peter Quill as a child. The ones that killed half of their ranks because they were loyal to Yondu. We do get to see the return of Taserface. And it's fantastic, but you do sort of question, well, he wouldn't be a good guy, would he? Because he wasn't a good guy in Guardians 2, he seemed pretty, you know. But I think the idea is just that T'Challa's this such pure person that he's able to convince them to do good. And I do think, obviously, that's the whole premise of the episode, that they take in T'Challa and he convinces them to be good. That's what the whole what if scenario is centered around. But you've just got to sort of accept it and roll with it. This is the story they're choosing to tell, and you just sort of have to go with it so that you can enjoy the rest of the story. Now, this rings somewhat true. How at the end of Black Panther, T'Challa decided to open Wakanda up, share Wakanda's resources with the world to the people that needed it. But I will say, in that movie, it did sort of feel like this only happened in a response to everything that Eric Killmonger did. It wasn't T'Challa's idea from the start. So to see him have that same ideology here feels like it rings a little untrue. It does feel like a bit of a stretch, because they do make this all-good character just seems really to conflict with the version of the character that we know. For instance, when we meet the character in Captain America Civil War, he spends half of the film trying to kill Bucky, the Winter Soldier. Yes, it's in revenge because he thinks Bucky killed his father, but whatever way you slice it, it certainly isn't this all-good motivation. He wants to kill him. So to see here T'Challa being completely perfect, being this goody two-shoes, it almost just feels like it is a completely different character. Perhaps that's because when they took him, he was a child, when he was a lot younger and when he was more innocent, and so he stayed more innocent. He never became disillusioned with politics. You know, they always said in Civil War how he wasn't much for politics. I don't know, like I said, it's all a bit of a stretch, but I think you just sort of have to go with it. It's fine. And I think that one of the final things I want to say is that this T'Challa was so different to the version that we know. So much so that Chadwick Boseman, who, yes, actually, we've not even acknowledged, he voices the character here. He does a fantastic job in this role. He was fantastic as a voice actor, and yeah, it's bittersweet to hear one of his final performances of the character. That after Chadwick Boseman had read the script for this episode, he started speaking to Kevin Feige and Ryan Coogler, the director of the Black Panther movies, in that saying that he loved this version of the character and he was hoping to incorporate elements of this version of the character into the script for Black Panther 2, which straight away tells you, yeah, it's not the same version of the character that he didn't play in all along. It's one that Chadwick loved to play, and I gotta say, I loved seeing it. You know, I've always loved Goody Two-Shoes characters. I love Superman. So I did like seeing it here. It just felt off to me because it's not the T'Challa, the Black Panther that I'm used to seeing. When comparing him to Peter Quill, in comparison, was not as good, not as perfect of a character as T'Challa. He's always been portrayed as being a bit of a loser, and while you might have always thought, well, that's because he was being brought up by the Ravagers, clearly that didn't really seem to affect T'Challa too much. You know, Peter already came from a broken home. He grew up without a father. His mum was suffering with cancer. We don't know how much she was ever really around, and we know that he was basically raised on the television. He idolised people like David Hasselhoff's character in Knight Rider. And when we see him when he's grown up, he thinks of himself as this sort of player. He doesn't seem like the nicest guy in the galaxy. And I think part of that is due to his Earth upbringing. Whereas T'Challa, he's grown up in a palace. He's been incredibly privileged. He's probably had everything he could have ever wanted or needed. And also he's taken at a point where he wants to go out and explore. He wants to see places other than Wakanda. Whereas Peter is taken in a place where his mother's just died. Peter was arguably a lot more vulnerable. And he was probably able to be taken advantage of a lot more by the Ravagers than T'Challa ever was. You know, Peter's always just portrayed as somewhat of a loser, whereas T'Challa, they literally call him Star-Lord. In fact, that was such a fantastic moment, contrasting how in the opening of Guardians of the Galaxy, when Peter says Star-Lord, he's responded to a who? Whereas in this, T'Challa doesn't call himself Star-Lord, he's called Star-Lord by other people. And I think that's such a nice, fantastic little touch. It's incredibly funny. It subverts our expectations and sets us up for how the rest of the episode is going to subvert our expectations with every single character that we meet. And from what we've seen of the Ravagers, they never felt like they were super awesome role models for Peter. Peter's never really had a father figure in his life, and the closest was Yondu, and he never really seemed like he was a great influence. I've seen some people say that this episode really makes Star-Lord look like even more of a loser. And the only thing I can say is, well, that was sort of always the point of the character, but you shouldn't expect Peter to be perfect. Like I said, T'Challa was brought up in such privilege that, of course, he knows how to convince people on his side. And if you think him convincing the Ravagers to be good is a stretch, well, just wait for it, because he convinces Thanos to be good. Apparently, all he needs to do was sit Thanos down and debate with him whether or not his plans for genocide were really a good idea. And Thanos goes, you know what? You're right, Star-Lord. I'm gonna join you as a Ravager and we're gonna do good. It's so ridiculous, it works. It is hilarious to see in the episode. And yes, like I said, it's a major stretch. But to be quite honest, I don't think it's that much more of a stretch than him convincing the Ravagers, which again is the whole point of the episode. Obviously, it's completely ridiculous. The version of Thanos that we know from the MCU probably could not have been talked down. Now, yes, obviously, he doesn't talk him down just before he's about to steal all the Infinity Stones. No, it happens a lot earlier, and the way we know that is that we actually see Nebula. And unlike how we see it in the Guardians films and the Avengers films, she's not all mechanical. She only actually has one mechanical upgrade on her eye. She even still has her original hair. Clearly, T'Challa met Thanos and managed to talk him down years ago before he'd planted all these upgrades into his own daughter, and so he saved her from her disfigurement. So maybe you could argue that this version of Thanos, he wasn't as far along on his plans, he wasn't as quite as set in stone on them. I don't know. Again, it's a massive stretch, but you know what? It's just really fun to watch. You can tell he's still got a wicked mind, he's still deliciously evil, but he's using himself as a force for good. I don't know, there's some like real charm to it, and I just love to see it. I think he's really funny in this episode. I really enjoy it. But yeah, overall, I did really enjoy this episode. I loved going to the Collector's Fortress. There was some great stuff with Howard the Duck. Howard the Duck's always a weird character. I can sort of take him in small doses, and I do think he was in this episode for pretty much just the right amount of time. It was an extended cameo. I really enjoyed seeing him here. I like seeing Cosmo the dog. I thought he's fun, and I liked how he sort of joined them all at the end of the episode. I liked the sort of heist storyline they were going. It was just such a fun episode. To me, the downfall is just that it was with completely new characters that we've never met before. And I almost felt like I could have seen a little bit more from them. But again, I really liked it. I do think that almost did play into the episode's favour as well. Because we had the sort of double cross twist with Nebula where it was like, oh no, she's double crossing him. It's like, oh no, she's actually double crossing the Collector. And T'Challa was actually in on it. And they all knew the plan all from the start. I really enjoyed that twist. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. Again, like I said, I loved this episode. I think just for me, there was a lot of things where I do sort of take a slight issue with it. It didn't stop my enjoyment of the episode, but I do just think I actually enjoyed last week's episode a little bit more, which I think might actually be slightly controversial from what I've seen online. Everyone seems to think this episode is a lot better. And like I said, the thing with T'Challa convincing the Ravagers to be good and Thanos being good, it didn't stop my enjoyment of the episode. I do just think it's a little bit of a stretch. But like I said, this episode is just all out bonkers alternate universe stuff. It's not really a one small change story. I know it tries to play it off as one, but when that change happens, like I said, 26 years ago, it's not one small change anymore, is it? And I think maybe the reason it bothers me so much is that I felt like that was what the series was setting the show up as being this one small change narrative, and that's not really what I got here. What we got, I still loved. I really enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to be watching this episode again. Chadwick Boseman in the role, absolutely fantastic. It was great to hear him again. It is somewhat bittersweet, yes, but I also know that he recorded 4 episodes for this series. Now, does that mean that this version of T'Challa will show up again within the series, or will there just be other episodes that happen to feature a version of T'Challa that will be voiced by Chadwick Boseman? I don't know. But as we discussed last week, I do think that these characters are going to be meeting up. There is going to be eventually some team up. We do sort of see him gathered with a few of the other characters in like an Avengers style shot. Maybe we'll see him again. Obviously, this is one of the what if characters that we definitely aren't going to be seeing revisited in live action. Whether or not there was originally plans for that to happen, I do not know. But of course, Chadwick Boseman is no longer with us, and so he will not be able to be playing a live-action T'Challa Star-Lord in a future multiverse movie, unlike how Hayley Atwell may possibly return as Peggy Carter. Chadwick Boseman, absolutely phenomenal in the role. His voice acting was fantastic. I think like every actor's voice acting was on point in this episode. And it was great to see that almost every single actor in this episode returned. The one notable one being that Dave Bautista didn't return to voice Drax the Destroyer. There was a bit of controversy online with that because, according to Dave Bautista, he was never asked. Now, the writers of the show have hit back and said they're not sure what happened there because every single actor was meant to have been asked. It was their understanding that everyone had been asked, or at least their agents had been asked. So is it quite possible that Dave Bautista's agents were asked and they said no? That's very possible. After all, he only actually had about 2 or 3 lines in the episode, so I can't imagine it was a big rate they were offering. Maybe his agents thought it was insultingly low, never even brought the proposal to Dave himself. I don't know. But you know what? He was barely in the episode. The guy they got to do Drax sounded spot on like Bautista. And he was just a funny little gag. Did it really need to be Dave for that? Probably not. But all the actors did a great job as voice acting. They all felt comfortable behind the microphone, unlike maybe some of the actors last week. And the only even notable person that didn't return was Chris Pratt as Star-Lord. But again, like I said, this character only had 1 line. Was it really worth bringing Chris Pratt back? I don't know whether it's that he didn't want to, or maybe they just told him it was 1 line. Is it worth it? It was certainly fun to see that little twist at the end, and like the Watcher says, maybe this version of the events weren't as perfect as we thought they were, because if this version of Peter goes along with Ego's plans, well, that could be the end of the galaxy. But he says that's a story for another time. Does that mean we will revisit this scenario, this what if universe, at some point, maybe in season 2 of this series? I'd definitely be interested to see with where they were going with that. I do think the idea of if Peter had stayed on Earth and Ego comes to get him. I think that's a really interesting concept. Equally as interesting as seeing T'Challa in space. I like the reasoning for the Ravagers picking up T'Challa, that they detected alien energy on the planet and they found T'Challa. Next to it, of course, we know that comes from the vibranium that fell to Earth. I thought that really works. It's a nice way of saying, well, if they weren't going to detect Peter, it makes sense that why they would have detected T'Challa. Because at first, when you do hear the concept of the episode, it seems so out there. What if T'Challa became a Star-Lord? Well, why would he? Well, now we know. Now, last week I didn't touch at all on the art style of the series. And I said I was going to be discussing it here, and so I'm going to discuss it here. Now, a few years back when we got our first look at this series, I think there was some images being released from D23. I saw the art style and I just wasn't really sure how to feel. I got the sense it was this 3D attempting to look like 2D, and of course I was correct. And even when I saw the first trailer about 8 months ago now, I didn't really love the style. It reminded me somewhat of when you look at the old MTV Spider-Man or Iron Man Armored Adventures. It's this somewhat clunky way of trying to make the 3D look 2D. I think it's something where I just ultimately go, can you not just do 3D or can you not just do 2D? The weird in-between thing never really worked for me. Obviously, one of the many reasons that they might do it is that to make a 3D render look good on a 2D budget can be hard, getting all the textures and the lighting to look right. So if you're going to sort of do a 2D cell shading thing on it, it sort of gets around that, but it still ends up looking somewhat clunky. It never looks as good as if you were just going to do 2D in the first place, but there are benefits of doing 3D animation. A character is built, you don't have to constantly redraw it, it's there, all you've got to do is move it. It adds a lot of depth into the frame, and I think in this series in particular, it allows them to do a lot of very cinematic things. It allows them to move the camera how they would in live action, which is something that can be very tricky and very complex to do in 2D animation. But you know what? As we got closer and closer to the series, I think maybe as I started to get more used to the style, as we got to see more trailers, the style started to really grow on me, to the point that when I watched episode 1 last week, I loved the style of it. I think it really works here. I think it's because, you know, these are the live action versions of the characters. You know, they're being voiced by the same actors. They are meant to be those versions of the characters, or at least twisted versions of those versions of the characters. This style in particular, it almost captures the live action look. You know, they kind of look like the actors they're meant to represent. Some of the characters look more accurate than others. It is always hard to cartoonify real people's faces. A lot of the time it can be hard. Certain people are more easy to caricature than others, and I think those characters definitely usually end up looking more like the characters from the live action film, whereas some of them maybe just look a little bit more generic and you just think, does that really look like the actor they're trying to look like? The thought did cross my mind that maybe some of the characters are just close enough that you go, yeah, that's the character, but not too close so that they don't have to pay the actors any royalties for their look. That being said, I think most actors that sign onto the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I imagine they sign their likeness away to be used in things like this, to be used in toys and used in other media. Much like the original Star Wars contracts, you know, Carrie Fisher always used to joke that every time she looked in the mirror, she owed George Lucas some money. And I wonder if the Marvel actors have a very similar contract. I'm basically saying, yeah, you can use my likeness if you want in a cartoon. I think that some of them are so close to the actors that no, they definitely must have some permission to let them look like that. I think it works really well. The shots all feel incredibly cinematic. Sure, you never forget you're watching animation. This definitely looks like a cartoon, but there's just something about it that does sort of capture that cinematic look. It just has a very familiarity with the live action setting. They're able to do certain things that you just don't see cartoons do that often. But at the same time, it's interesting that I talk about cinematic, because I'd actually argue that some of the shots in this look even better than the Marvel movies ever really have before. Is it to do with the fact that in animation you have that whole storyboarding process where they've really thought out all the shots, which maybe you don't always have in live action to quite the same degree? Is that why this looks so much better? Or is it the fact that because it's animation, everything's bright and colourful, you know, you don't have the colour grading problems that you have in the live action Marvel movies, where they all look somewhat grey and somewhat flat. Here, everything's full of life and full of colour. I think it's fantastic. And I know the style they were going for is meant to be like the J.C. Leyendecker illustrations, and I can sort of see what they were going for. I don't know if I'd say they 100% captured it. Obviously, it's very different. They're incredibly detailed illustrations, whereas this is some sort of cel-shaded CGI. But I can sort of see what they're going for. I feel like the way they structure the faces, it seems very much in that style, but again, obviously 3D looking 2D. Overall, I really enjoy seeing it, and I can't wait to see more of it. I think it worked incredibly well in the more grounded World War II era of last week, but it also worked incredibly well in the more bright, cartoonish outer space galaxy world of this episode. I think it is a style that they've found that's just going to work for so many different situations, which is perfect for this series because every episode is going to be a different situation. It's not like how in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, how when they're going for a 2D look, they're going for that comic book look. No, they're not. They're going for this classic illustrative look, but not comic book illustrations. These painterly ones. It's really interesting. It's a really nice approach, and I think it does help bridge that gap so that you can tell that, yeah, it's a cartoon, but these are still those live action versions of the characters that you know and love. They just have an air about them that reminds you of the live action versions of those characters. And that about wraps things up. Next week's episode 3, which like I said, I do think is probably already going to have aired when you're watching this. Not much is known about it, but the main thing that I do know is that it is going to be set during Fury's big week. So presumably it's going to be tying into events of Iron Man 2, The Incredible Hulk, and Thor. All those movies were set around the same time. Remember, Coulson got the call to go to New Mexico because the hammer had been found during Iron Man 2. Also, in a later scene in Iron Man 2, you do see the Incredible Hulk battling Abomination on the news. All those films happened around the same time, and I think that's actually a great place to place an episode of What If. You do want to get ready for that episode. Well, if you look on Marvel Legends, what we talked about last week, the series that's giving 7-minute recaps, they released one a few weeks ago all on the Avengers Initiative, showing Fury's plans to set up the Avengers, and most of that takes place in the span of these films. So I think that's a good way to set you up for next week's episode, for episode 3, to sort of remind you what pieces are in play, where everyone is when this episode is going to be taking place. Of course, if you want, you can re-watch those movies, but that's 3 movies to watch before this episode. It's up to you whether you want to do that. I don't know how necessary it's going to be, especially if they're going to be cutting back and forth between all of those movies. They're probably not going to be staying in one specific movie for too long, but it's up to you. If you want to get super hyped for next week's episode, maybe watch those 3 movies. Like I did say, I feel like watching Guardians of the Galaxy this week did almost backfire on me because I ended up comparing the episode to Guardians, and I don't think they really wanted us to do that. But I don't think every episode is going to be as massively divergent as this one was. So it's up to you. If you want to get hyped, the option's always there to watch those 3 movies beforehand, or maybe just watch the Avengers Initiative Marvel Legends episode. It's 7 minutes long. That might just do it. Alright everyone, I just want to say thanks for watching this video. What did you think of the episode? Let me know down below. I'd love to talk to some of you about it. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give it a like because it really helps us out and lets it get seen by more people. And if you haven't done so yet, why don't you hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell to be notified the next time we dive down the tube of tunes and break down an episode of What If. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Cheers. Thanks for watching Tube of Tunes. If you want more from the channel, hit subscribe. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on, follow us on our socials. Hope you liked it. Cheers.